All right, let's jump into some more apologetics here. And hopefully my brightly colored shirt will keep you awake. So we left off with what is the purpose of apologetics. And by the way, this is all introductory material, isn't it? So it's like a lot of questions that we're just answering, sort of a prolegomena approach to apologetics, just at the outset. So again, what is the purpose of apologetics? We put this under a couple of subheadings to answer the question, and one had to do with an epistemological approach. So if we're thinking purposefully, then we're sort of delimiting or creating some parameters or bracketing in the answer to this about the purpose of apologetics according to what we said were in the last little talk of ours, in the last session, religious epistemologies. Epistemologies being, how do we know what we know? How do we know stuff? We're just talking about knowledge. We think we know stuff, How do we know stuff? What is knowing? What does it mean to know? Wow, it hurts the brain to start, considering just knowing stuff. Remember, we talked about sense experience and perceptions and interpreting all of these things, stuff that happens, things we hear, immediately we start thinking, and then we think we know, and what is it that we perceive and interpret that into some kind of knowledge somehow, cognition, whatever that is. But then that depends on, can we know this God? Well, is he self-revelatory? Indeed, the Christian answer is yes, he is self-revelatory in a general sense. He made stuff. He made us. He made nature so we can observe the phenomena of nature, individual phenomenon, and then phenomena, multiple observations, multiple things to observe. And at least we can observe some things. Can we observe everything? Some things intuitively. Just let the mind wander a bit. How much observation actually can you observe of reality, right? Where are we going with this? So anyway, we find then that there are the noetic effects of sin. How much damage has sin done to this process of our ability then to make these kinds of observations and draw these kinds of conclusions then about God. And so we talked about that a little bit. And then we want to just hit that second kind of layer, that second tier of this discussion, and that sort of depends, right? What's the purpose of apologetics? Well, that depends, you say. That depends on the noetic effects of sin on the human mind, on the human mental framework, on our capacity, And then that depends on is God completely transcendent? Is God immanent? And to what degree is he transcendent? How much do we emphasize the transcendence of God, the otherness of God? And how much do we emphasize the immanence of God? How much do we emphasize the noetic effects of sin? And so on, right? Well, of course, we're not getting into all of that here, but these are just considerations, right? Just things to ponder, to think about. And then what else could we say? That depends. That depends. What is the purpose of apologetics? And you say, that depends. Thank you for saying that. That depends. That depends on the way arguments are constructed. The way arguments are constructed. So Stephen Cohen, for example, argues for a more practical classification of apologetic methods. And this on the basis of distinctive ways, to quote him, distinctive ways of presenting the case for Christianity, distinctive types of structures of argument. So he identifies 5 approaches. So this is where really classically people will denominate or articulate various approaches, and then we could say purposes of apologetics, and this would be more like a methodological approach or methodologies as applied to apologetics. Methodologies meaning, what do you expect to do with this apologetic? You know, what apologetic method do you expect to use? How useful will apologetics be to you? What given enterprise? To what end then? To what end? To what goal? To what purpose? What function will apologetics serve you? And Cohen is going to describe it in kind of a practical way, a practical classification of these things. One would be that of William Lane Craig, R.C. Sproul, Norman Geisler, Stephen Davis, Richard Swinburne. Before I get into those, a bit of a break here, Let's just put a pin in that, and some bibliographic stuff. I just pulled right over there. I can't move the camera because it's on a wall over there. So I'm in Johnstown, New York at the church. Camera's on the wall. One of the cameras on the wall over there is my office. Got just scads of books in there, and they're not in order, so I'd be embarrassed to show it to you. They're thrown on the wall in there. But I did grab a bunch of apologetic stuff, just a few of them, right? So I mentioned Geisler. Didn't I mention Geisler? Here's Christian Apologetics, you know, one of his standards. And then a few times we've mentioned Faith Has Its Reasons. This is, ooh, that sounds weighty, right? Kenneth Boa and Bauman, right here. Right? Faith Has Its Reasons. We've mentioned that a couple times. How about Reasonable Faith? William Lane Craig used to use this. I remember the first time taught this course at Davis, I assigned this one as the text. Didn't go over well. No. I thought it was a good book. Really, it is a good book. See, I highlighted it, circled stuff, and did all that, you know, did my part. But didn't go over well. It actually was a text that he developed for his grad school. Might have been at Talbot Seminary. Yeah, so a bit intense, but it's good. I actually have this PDF digital version that if you actually want it, if I can find it somewhere in my archives, I'd be happy to just fly it over to you. But that's Reasonable Faith. Good stuff, and I think you can handle it. How about Moreland, J.P. Moreland? So I had J.P. Moreland in grad school somewhere along the way. Love God with all your mind. This is a nice little short and sharp little reader. J.P. Moreland, great philosopher. Little paperback deal. You can get that fairly inexpensively. And then if you want the big, full-blown, in-your-face, tiny print, wow, this one will, and it's heavy. But this is Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Everything you conceivably could want to know in order to argue and defend for a Christian worldview. Oh, yes. Hey, there's chapter 8. What is metaphysics? Indeed. What else? There's Moreland. Throw him over there. Cornelius Van Til, right? The Defense of the Faith. Yes, indeed. Mark Clark, this interesting subtitled Answering Skeptics, A Skeptic's Challenges to Christianity. Interesting little read. Read it on a plane, I think, a couple years ago. Not sure when this... Łazienko, Poland, 2019. Yeah, on my way to summer camp ministry in 2019. So it was a few years ago. Blew through that one. Very, very readable. Not that there's a problem with God, but the problem people have with God, right? That was an interesting read. How about this one? Just got this, Baker Academic, 2021, Gavin Ortland. He's at where? PhD, Fuller Theological Seminary. He serves as senior pastor, First Baptist Church. Is it OJAI? I'll let you take a shot at how you pronounce that. And that's in California. So one of those all-around scholar, pastor, everything people. Why God makes sense in a world that doesn't. And it looked to me like a very interesting read. Very interesting. Kind of contextualizes worldview arguments for the existence of God, or at least contextualizes it with a lot of the questions people are asking today, probably in light of problem of evil types of issues that people are having today, things of that nature. And it would not be complete if we didn't throw in at least a few by Alvin Plantinga, Knowledge and Christian Belief. Don't let the thinness of that book fool you. That's a beaut. And this one, Warranted Christian Belief. He's, of course, well known for his arguments on that, God and Other Minds. This was I want to say an award winner, but probably should have been well-acclaimed book on the subject of rational justification for belief in God. I say rational justification for those types of things. People like Aquinas in the Middle Ages creating those types of rational justifications for belief in God. In other words, not just theological, scriptural constructs for belief in God, in other words, preaching to the choir, but trying to create philosophical constructs and justification, rational justification, bringing God then into the philosophical. Now, you have to keep in mind then post-Enlightenment time. This is the late 1700s, where we have the Enlightenment and the rise of secular humanism, attempting to bring then Christianity into that forum and speaking to those types of philosophical constructs. These are the kinds of, I suppose, ways of entering into public discourse with some of those folks. To what effect? I don't know to what effect directly with those types of individuals, but I find when those types of conversations take place, it is those that view the public, those that view those types of conversations to step back and say, the Christianity, those Christian apologists, not everyone will take this view, but many will say, they really do have answers. I mean, they really do hold their own. And it isn't just a bunch of smoke and mirrors, a bunch of sophistry or something like that. But yeah, I can really say I didn't really realize. I thought Christianity was just something of priests and rituals and dead, dry cathedrals and all of that. I didn't realize that it actually made rational sense. Hence, reasonable. I didn't realize it was reasonable. And I remember going back a couple of lectures when I said, if you can come to the center of the room should be your goal. Not to try to fight somebody over, but to bring them just to the middle. Can we meet in the middle someplace? And I would suggest that the middle is a place of being seen as reasonable. Reasonable. And that is the starting point. To see each other as both reasonable people, and then to have a civil discussion. Irenic. The only place that you want a polemic, and why am I doing this? Because that's polemics. Polemic. The only place you want polemics is when you're dealing with a heretic. That's an internal thing, And when you're dealing with a polemic, it's time to, the individual. Okay, so getting back to then, Depends on what? Depends on what? What's the purpose of apologetic? Well, that depends. Okay, it depends on what. And the second thing we're saying is it depends on the way arguments are constructed. And then we're saying that there are these various approaches or methodologies to apologetics. One would be the classical method, and we say that's so. If you're a classical apologetic, if you're saying, well, I do classical apologetics, that's what I do. Yeah, put me in the classical camp. Well, what do you mean when you say that? You're somebody who aims to establish theism. Theism would mean, well, I'm a monotheist. What does that mean? You mean that there is one God, a personal creator God, who is responsible for the origin of all things, and not only creator, but a sustainer of all things, not a deist who created and ran away, but one who is actively engaged in that which he has created, but aims to establish theism through arguments from nature, then to present evidences, such as cosmological, in other words. You are looking at nature and saying that there are certain observations from nature itself that infer. There are inferences from observations about nature. And those inferences tell us something about God, about theism then. Then, once you can establish something, now those aren't going to be drop-down arguments and proof for the existence of God, but you establish something there. There is some predicate there. Then that it allows you to present evidences to prove that Christianity is the correct version of theism. So it brings you into the camp of theism, but then you could say, well, okay, but Muslims on the western side of the bank of reality, Muslims could say, as contradistinction from Eastern pantheism or monistic pantheism, you could say, well, Muslims could argue the same yes, and Jews could argue the same, sure. And so you'd say, well, then you're saying that Christianity is the correct version of theism based on these inferences. But we have to get there first, right? And so you begin. Classical theism says, well, wait, let's make some general observations first to at least establish a theistic framework. And then we'll get from general revelation, we'll get to special revelation. So most proponents of this method claim there is no point of presenting arguments from historical evidence until the person has embraced a theistic worldview, as they will always interpret them based on their own worldview. So in other words, you could, if you took a presuppositional approach, which you come to, and just get right to the Bible or something, then that person, until they're at least brought into the theistic camp, or at least can say, okay, there's the natural order of things, but if you begin with some assertions of God, some assertions of His Son, Jesus Christ, or things of this nature, they're just going to continually come back and come back and come back. Oh, how can you expect me to believe in Jesus when I don't believe in God? Right? And so, for example, to just go back to the camp a few weeks ago, in Poland, with that very same question. How do you expect me to believe in Jesus when I don't even believe in God? And so I just switched gears and I began opening, my comments before making those type of presuppositional assertions, which is what you do every time you open the Bible and start teaching, right? Start talking about Jesus and making assertions about Jesus. Jesus said this, Jesus said that, Jesus claimed this, Jesus claimed that. And an atheist sits there and says, well, okay, but that's all well and good, but I have no conceptual foundation from which I draw any explanatory value whatsoever about this Jesus of whom you speak. So, you have to begin laying a bit of foundation. Now, granted, We just have a short amount of time, and at this particular time it was obsessively hot and people are sweating. So I'm walking up and down and among them and doing everything I can to keep their attention. But we began talking. I set up 3 chairs and began explaining each chair and what each chair means in terms of potential worldviews, and doing all this very, very quickly. But talking about, here's all this stuff and where did it come from, and you've got this kind of option, and who. So you have to begin introducing the mind of possibility and potential, right? So you only have certain possibilities. Matter created itself or it didn't. Which is it? And why? And what's your evidence? Okay, and then leave that hanging and let them ponder that. And then move on, right? So anyway, classical method, which is where I would fall. This is where I would be. I would be a classical apologist, right? So I'm going to create at least a conceptual place, conceptual construct in the mind for a requirement for a necessary being. And that would be a philosophical definition for God. That is someone who is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, a first cause, before I ever get to the God of the Bible, right? And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to lay that type of philosophical foundation with someone, depending on who the person is, how I'm going to explain that, right? All right, so blah, 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 right? The next, so just before I say that, there's a need to establish a worldview whereby the natural world, that the universe is contingent on something other than itself, right? So here's everything that exists, everything that began to exist. Why is there all this stuff and not nothing, right? So this is it, right? And so this would be based on, just based on sensory perception. Here's all this stuff. Here's all this stuff. And so most people can conceive of the fact that they exist. Right? They exist. They exist because their parents exist, and so far in infinite regression. Is there infinite regression in terms of the matter around them? Or was there a beginning? Was there a time before which there was nothing? And if so, how did something come from nothing? Is it within matter? That is time, space, matter, energy to create itself, so on. It's just things to think about. Evidential methods, classical evidential methods. This would be Gary Habermas. Well, let's do it by evidence. Let's look at the evidence, right? Gary Habermas, John Warwick Montgomery. He and I are born in the same place. Isn't that amazing? Not in the same year. Clark